Good morning, everyone. I'm John Gehring. I'm the Catholic Program Director at Faith and Public Life. Thanks so much for tuning in this morning for our conversation about LGBTQ families, adoption, and the battles over religious liberty. This is a very timely topic. The Supreme Court will rule any day now. We actually thought it might come out this morning on the case of Fulton versus the City of Philadelphia, which could allow Catholic social services in that city to receive city contracts and public funding while discriminating against LGBTQ families and also get taxpayer money for that. Before I introduce the panelists today, and we've got a great group of people who I'm really excited to hear from, let me offer just a few brief remarks to help contextualize our conversation. This Supreme Court case is really emblematic of broader national debates over LGBTQ rights and religious liberty that are playing out in the courts, legislatures, and in Christian universities across our country. LGBT Catholics and allies are watching this case very closely, and the ruling will be handed down at a time when there are very intense debates going on in the Catholic Church over how to recognize the dignity of same-sex couples. As many of you know, in March, the Vatican's Doctrine Office reiterated that the Church cannot offer blessings to same-sex couples. And this was met by understandable sadness and outrage by LGBT Catholics and allies, and not just lay Catholics. A number of Catholic bishops, particularly in Germany, spoke out on this issue and expressed disappointment with the Doctrine's Office statement. So that's part of the backdrop to our conversation. On the specific issue of same-sex couples and adoption, I should note that Bethany Christian Services, which is an evangelical agency, and it's one of the largest adoption and foster agencies in the country with offices in 32 states, recently changed its policy and announced it would begin placing children with same-sex couples. And that was a very significant ruling, a very significant policy change, I should say. In contrast, Catholic agencies are not moving in that direction. Over the years, Catholic agencies in Washington, D.C., Boston, and other places have actually closed their doors on adoption and foster services rather than place children with same-sex couples. I really believe it's a false choice to pit dignity for LGBTQ Catholics families against religious liberty. Most people of faith support non-discrimination policies, and religious liberty should never be weaponized to deny LGBTQ couples an equal opportunity to adopt and raise children. Let's be clear, Catholic and other faith-based agencies provide vital social services, but public funding should not be used to discriminate. So today you're going to hear from parents who have adopted, and you're going to hear from a legal scholar who filed a friend of the court brief in this Supreme Court case. So let me introduce them to you now. I'm really happy and honored to be joined by Mary Ann Duddy-Burke. She's the Executive Director of Dignity USA, a national advocacy organization for LGBTQI Catholics. Mary Ann is a frequent media commentator whose writing has been featured in the New York Times, the National Catholic Reporter, and other publications. In January of 2020, Mary Ann was honored by the National LGBTQ Task Force. She's been recognized for her longtime leadership for LGBTQ justice issues by many organizations, including Greater Boston Business Council. And she lives in Boston with Becky, her spouse, more than 25 years, and their two adopted children, Emily and Finn. So welcome, Mary Ann. Thank you for being with us. I'd also like to introduce John Fremmel. John and his husband, Rick, adopted their two children through the foster care system in Illinois after experiencing discrimination at a private agency due to their sexual orientation. John is currently an online teaching specialist at the Springfield campus of the University of Illinois, and he also teaches introductory courses in women's and gender studies at Lincoln Land Community College. He served for over 4 years as the coordinator of Equally Blessed, a coalition of progressive Catholic organizations committed to working on behalf of LGBTQI+ Catholics and their families. And he has previously served on the Vision Council for Call to Action. So welcome, John. Thank you for being with us today. And finally, I'm really honored to have Dr. Leslie Griffin. She's the William S. Boyd Professor of Law at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas Law School, and an expert on the intersection of religion and the law. She filed a friend of the court brief in the Fulton case on the side of the city of Philadelphia, and she holds a doctorate in religious studies from Yale University and a JD from Stanford Law School. She's also the director of Amicus Advocacy for Child USA, a national nonprofit think tank working to end child abuse and neglect. So thanks for all of you for taking the time to be with us today and sharing your stories and expertise. Marianne, I wanted to start with you. I wrote a piece in the National Catholic Reporter a few weeks back that dug into this issue, and I really enjoyed having a chance to speak to you for that story. And you shared your story with me, and I would love for the viewers to kind of hear your experience. But just in summary, about 2 decades ago, you wanted to adopt as a child. And as a Catholic, of course, your first thought was to go through a Catholic agency. But I know that was a very painful and difficult experience for you. I was wondering if you could share a little bit about that personal story and sort of how that impacted you as a Catholic and how you think about sort of the backdrop of this Supreme Court case we're all watching so closely.
Yeah, thank you, John, and everybody at Faith in Public Life for inviting me to be part of this. It's really a privilege. When Becky and I decided that we wanted to expand our family by adopting through foster care, we did go directly to Catholic Charities, primarily because, we both had very strong Catholic faith, and that was really important to our identity. And practically, Catholic Charities ran the vast majority of adoption and foster care service in our area. We made call after call after call to the local office and never got a response. And finally, a staff person called us on personal time, on a personal cell phone, to tell us that there was an intentional decision not to allow a lesbian couple into the system, that Catholic Charities just would not train us, would not place a child with us. And when we got that call, I felt every breath leave my body. To be judged as inadequate and not seen as fit to raise a child without anybody taking the time to even talk to us and to know who we were as individuals, just categorized based on the fact that we were 2 women on the phone call list, was just devastating. It was very hurtful. Fortunately, we were part of a small intentional Eucharistic community called Dignity Boston, so we had an affirming and supportive Catholic community around us. But I think if we had been part of a traditional parish, that might have been the end of our connection with Catholicism. It just cut to the bone in a way that was unimaginable. We did luckily find our way into the system by going directly through the state eventually, and were able to, over time, adopt 2 children. We've also done emergency foster care and kinship foster care and been trainers and helped to recruit other families and support them through what can be a very challenging process. And consider our roles as parents to be probably the most important in our lives. But I have to say that the trauma of the experience actually stayed with us. For example, Becky and I were invited to be plaintiffs in the marriage equality case that went to the Massachusetts Supreme Court and started the whole trend. And at that point, our older daughter, Emily, had been placed with us, but the adoption wasn't finalized. And the experience with Catholic Charities made us so fearful, that our child could be taken from us if we were seen as making a misstep, or if someone in power decided it was not a good situation, that we backed out of that opportunity because we didn't want to be seen as criticizing the state, and interacting with doctors, interacting with schools, anybody who felt like they had power. Until those adoption papers were signed, we never felt fully secure that our child was really going to be our child.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for sharing that story with us. I know even though it's been many years since you've gone through that, it still sits with you and affects your faith. So I appreciate you reflecting on that experience with us. John, I wanted to ask you, so, I mean, we know from research that same-sex parents are 7 times more likely to raise adopted and foster children, and that's according to the Williams Institute at UCLA School of Law. And we also know that LGBTQ children and youth are overrepresented in the foster care system in many cases because they're rejected by their family for their sexual orientation or gender identity. And it often feels like to me when we talk about these issues of LGBTQ rights and religious liberty, the conversation is often framed in a very, either ideological way or in political terms. But I think often the human piece, the human dimension of this gets lost. And you obviously bring, as does Mary Ann, a very tangible, real life connection to this. Could you talk about why you wanted to be a parent, what the adoption experience was like for you? And I know you had some challenges too at first, as Mary Ann did. And again, with the backdrop of this case, maybe sort of, share some thoughts about what's sitting on your mind and heart right now.
Sure. So again, thank you for convening this panel discussion. This is so important. My husband and I have been together almost 14 years, married 6 of those, and having children was something both of us wanted. After being together nearly a decade, at that point, it just seemed time. So we made a conscious choice to adopt from foster care. Our faith played a large role in that. In coming to that decision, we had considered other ways to have children, in vitro fertilization, international adoption, et cetera. But ultimately, we looked around and saw a real need in our local community, kids who needed homes. And for us, it almost felt disingenuous to go through such extraordinary means to find a child when there were so many close by, just a few miles from where we lived. So we found a private agency who we thought would protect LGBTQ parents from discrimination. And at first, we didn't have any problems with the licensing process, the home study, all of that goes into this. And in January of 2016, we actually took home a newborn baby from the hospital. We were told at the time that the mother had essentially abandoned her, and within a few months, we would be able to adopt her. Everything was going well until some distant relatives of the girl found out that she was with same-sex parents, and that's when everything started to go downhill. This started essentially a year-long battle in the family court. We argued that the family had known about the birth of this girl and chose not to take her. They only wanted her because of our sexual orientation. In the meantime, she'd been allowed to bond with us during some very crucial developmental periods in her life. And the state of Illinois even hired several child psychology experts to weigh in and examine the case, and they ended up agreeing with us. Illinois also has some really strong anti-discrimination laws for foster care and adoption. So it seemed like we were going to win our case. But ultimately, the judge ruled against us. And at that point, we had exhausted our funds. We couldn't afford to appeal. And we had to let her go. And that was really the most heartbreaking thing I have ever experienced in my life. It felt like a death. It felt like my daughter had died. And it took a long time for my husband and me to process that and to get back on our feet and to start the healing process. The most ironic thing about all of this is that on paper, Illinois has really strong LGBTQ protections for foster parents, and this shouldn't have happened to us, but somehow it still did. So ultimately, at the end of 2017, someone who was sympathetic to our case within the state of Illinois Department of Children and Family Services helped us transfer our foster care license away from that agency. And 2 children were placed with us, Jordan and Riley. They're 6 and 7 now, and we adopted them in May of 2019. So there's a happy ending to all of this, I guess. But in terms of the wider context, and in some of our discussion before the panel, we were reflecting on what leaders in the church might learn from LGBTQ parents. And what I would say is that first and foremost, we are human. And it feels like what is lost in so many of these proclamations from church leaders is our basic humanity and dignity. We want the same things everyone else does. We want to love. We want to share life with others. We want to be loved by others. And that's ultimately what everybody wants and needs. And it's really no different for LGBTQ people. Some of us feel called to live out our vocation in married life and with children, and I use the word vocation with intention. The Catholic Church calls itself pro-life, and I don't know what is more pro-life than that, really. So as we already know, as you alluded to, children being raised by same-sex parents are no worse off than children of heterosexual parents. Some even argue that they're more open-minded, more accepting of diversity and difference because of their life experiences. And so to me, there's really nothing more sacred and holy than that. And that's really how I approach this entire topic.
Thank you, John. I appreciate those reflections. And I'm also glad it had a happy ending as well. Professor Griffin, you're our resident legal expert, and I know you were scouring the SCOTUS blog this morning, like all of us, trying to find out whether this ruling would come down today, and it did not. You filed a friend of the court brief in this case, which I should also note was signed by Miguel Diaz, a former U.S. ambassador to the Vatican, and also the brief was supported by Mary Ann's organization, Dignity USA, and also New Ways Ministry, another LGBTQ Catholic group. Leslie, these are issues you've been working on and writing about for many years. Can you provide some context for us about sort of the key legal questions at stake in this case and what we might expect as far as a ruling, given what you observed with the oral arguments? I know you can't read the tea leaves, but in terms of some context of what we might be expecting here.
All right. Well, good morning, and thanks for having me participate in this panel. So for me, it's all about discrimination. As a woman, I've known for most of my life that religious organizations, just like secular ones, can discriminate against women. And that experience taught me to try to understand more fully what other people were going through when they went through discrimination. And so I've tried to understand how people have suffered from racial discrimination. And I've tried to understand how people are suffering from LGBTQ discrimination. And in my mind, discrimination is discrimination. It's not a good thing, and it's not something that the laws of the United States should uphold. And I wrote my brief while people were debating the George Floyd situation, which had the media pay attention to what lawyers have known, right? That when people were debating interracial marriage, a lot of religions said you couldn't have interracial marriage. The old religions supported slavery and were not for racial equality. And the court gradually moved away from that. The lower court opinion in the intermarriage case said that the Bible didn't allow interracial marriage. And finally, the Supreme Court gave us a unanimous decision saying interracial marriage was legal. Now, as I said at the beginning, my view is that discrimination is discrimination. And Philadelphia has an anti-discrimination law that says you can't discriminate against gay and lesbian foster parents. And I think everyone should obey the anti-discrimination laws. And so my hope is that the Supreme Court would agree with me and agree with the majority of Catholics who support LGBTQ rights, right, which is something that people forget sometimes. And so my hope would be that just as in the racial discrimination cases, the court would say the law is against discrimination and anybody who does foster care business with the city of Philadelphia has to obey that law. But unfortunately, on the court, we had a close decision on same-sex marriage. and some justices who can't support same-sex marriage. Now, my hope looking to the future is that we'll get to the point where people see that discrimination on racial grounds, on gender grounds, on sexual orientation grounds is all something that the states cannot support, and that there is no religious freedom right to discriminate. And as you said, I was on my computer at 7, I'm in the West, at 7 my time, waiting to see if the court told us today. But the next day we'll get to find out. What they're doing is Tuesday morning. So Tuesday morning at 10 Eastern time, we'll see what opinions they release.
I appreciate that. And also thank you for getting up early out there in Las Vegas to be with us today. And we'll loop back with Leslie on some more specific legal questions later in the discussion. Marianne, I wanted to turn back to you. I mean, you've been advocating for LGBTQI justice in the Catholic Church for many decades now. And I know you've heard the arguments from the church, from church leaders, from Catholic agencies that say, look, this is a basic religious freedom issue for us, and we should not be forced to violate our teaching, our religious conscience, and LGBTQ couples can certainly adopt from other agencies. And I know you know that argument. How do you respond when you hear that? And I'm just curious, have you had any kind of dialogue with Catholic agencies or Catholic bishops or leaders about that? And do you find sort of any movement or reception to understanding that argument, or is it still met with the same argument we have been hearing for a while?
Yeah, as Dr. Griffin said, there is a very basic issue here in terms of discrimination. But I think the other piece that we haven't really brought up that is essential here is around the best interest of the child, which has been often overlooked in these conversations. And these claims of the prioritization of religious liberty and that such high weight be given to religious or moral beliefs really seem to contradict two essential mandates of our faith as Catholics, and indeed of many faiths. And one is that duty to care for the most vulnerable, the widow, the orphaned. That's a command that is given over and over in our scriptures. And personally, I really grieve that church leaders and social service program administrators have shifted the priority so that the needs of children in care are not their top concern. Secondly, it's a central tenet of Catholic social justice teaching to break down oppressive and discriminatory structures. And making it harder for some people, whether they're LGBTQ people, Black and brown people, people of minority faiths, folks whose marital status is not seemed as consistent with the faith, making it harder for those folks to create or expand their families is really unjust. So in this case, our church is actually erecting barriers rather than striving to remove them. I know that there are people within these systems, both in the chanceries and in the Catholic social service agencies, who really are struggling with these issues. For example, in Buffalo, the workers at the Catholic Charities office there really were trying to convince their agency leaders and the board not to end adoptions and foster care and to welcome LGBTQ people into the system, but they lost. These conversations are happening. Most Catholics want our focus to be on the needs of the children, to create every available home that is possible for kids who are waiting in care. Over 120,000 children in foster care are waiting for homes, and the more that we narrow them, the more bad outcomes those children are likely to face. And I think that's where the focus of this conversation really needs to be.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And to your point about Boston and some of the the Catholic employees who really struggle with this and disagree with the decision, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, when Catholic Charities in Boston closed its doors on adoption years ago because of this, there were several people who resigned, because of that decision. So I think you point to a very important point, which is even inside the church, there are people who disagree with this and who are really struggling. I mean, people who are working for great agencies that do, as I said earlier, vital and important work, but really see this as a human rights and justice issue and really struggle with how the church has decided to move forward on this issue. John, I wanted to turn back to you. I mean, when we spoke for the story I did in National Catholic Reporter, you talked about being raised Catholic. I think you went to Catholic schools for 12 years, which is a significant amount of time, as did I. And you worked for a while for Equally Blessed, the coalition we talked about earlier. And I think you even mentioned to me that you were considering going back perhaps for a mass when the Vatican's statement saying that there could be no blessing at all for LGBTQ couples and families came out, which was just devastating to you and so many. I'm just curious, I mean, how are you grappling with that aspect of your Catholic identity, and particularly as you think about raising children in a religious context or not? How is the church's decisions on many of these issues, whether it's firing LGBTQ employees at schools, to opposing the Equality Act, to the position here in this Fulton case, how has that impacted sort of how you think about your own faith and how you think about raising your children in a faith context or not?
Yeah, when I think about my own children having been adopted from foster care, they have already experienced a tremendous amount of pain and trauma just because of the situations that they were born into and the inability of their biological parents to care for them. And because of that, I am hyper aware of situations that could bring them even more trauma. So when I look at my local Catholic church, the diocese, the parishes in it, the bishop who leads it, I see a lot of opportunities here for additional trauma. And that could be a priest who calls their parents intrinsically evil or objectively disordered in a homily, or it could be a religious education teacher stating that there's something wrong with their family, or it could even be them witnessing us being denied the Eucharist in a communion line. All of those could add to the pain and trauma that they already have. And for that reason, for me, it's been almost impossible to step foot inside of a Catholic church since our kids first came to live with us back in 2017. For me personally, growing up gay and Catholic, I experienced what I would call a lot of religious trauma. I have my own story of grappling with self-hatred as a young boy, my own struggle to reconcile my faith and my sexuality. But at the same time, out of that, I think came a certain resiliency, if that's the right word. I think in terms of what the bishops say and what the church does, I'm tough. I can take what's thrown at me, but that's changed now that I have kids who I am charged to protect. And it's a whole other story. I just don't want them to have to experience the things that I experienced growing up gay in the church, and I need to protect them from that. And, frankly, it's offensive to me to think that if my children had been placed with a Catholic social service agency, they wouldn't be with us today. My family wouldn't exist today. I know that my family is holy and sacred because of who we are. And like I mentioned before, my relationship with my husband is life-giving and life-affirming, and nothing the church says or does can take that away from us. And honestly, why would they want to? I mean, who could look at my family today and say that something is wrong? I don't know if I can really say that I identify as Catholic today. What I can say is that I don't worship a God who condemns what he has created because of how he created them. I know that my vocation is to be out, gay, a father of 2 beautiful kids. I know that I'm baptized. I know that nobody can take that away from me. And as Marianne said, given how many kids there are who need loving, stable homes, and the desire of so many same-sex couples to provide those homes, I don't understand why anybody is saying no to them.
I really appreciate that. And I'll just say too, is one father to another, I appreciate how you describe your family as holy and sacred. And I completely agree with that and appreciate your spiritual resilience in face of some pretty serious trauma that you and your family should not have to have gone through. So thank you again for sharing in a very personal way your experience. Dr. Griffin, I wanted to turn back to you in terms of sort of sussing out some of the legal aspects in this case. You talked at length and clearly about the racial discrimination parallel and how important that is. So I wanted to maybe see, do you see other legal issues here that really came to the fore, particularly in the oral arguments? And tell me if I'm wrong. I mean, one thing I've been thinking about in the Masterpiece cake decision, which, you know, allowed a baker not to, a same-sex couple went in and wanted a cake to be prepared for their wedding, and the court ruled that the baker had I believe like a First Amendment or a right not to do that on First Amendment grounds, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong. Does that issue come up in this case, or are we dealing with a different set of issues in this case? And what did you see from the oral arguments that jumped out to you in terms of what we could potentially expect as far as a ruling?
Well, I think people are struggling because many people think religious freedom is always a good thing. And so whenever the law protects it, that's great. And what we've slowly learned, even if you listen to the terrible stories that Marianne and John have told us this morning, listen to the suffering that religions have put people through. But often on the court, there's an idea of, oh, we've got to protect religious freedom because it's protected by the First Amendment. And that's the risk of the court, which does, I will say, have 7 Catholics on it. That the idea is that, oh, as in the Masterpiece cake, we can't get in the way of religious freedom because that's good. And what we're trying to convince the courts and other people is that just as religions do wonderful things, they often do terrible things. And it's for the well-being of everybody that we say that everybody has to follow the anti-discrimination laws. Now, one of the problems at the oral argument is that the court usually doesn't like racial discrimination. Everybody's kind of wary not to say, oh, we'll allow you to racially discriminate. But they think sexual orientation discrimination isn't as bad, or that there's different kinds of discrimination. Justice Kagan raised some good questions, saying, if Fulton wins, does that mean that an agency could say, oh, we don't want Jewish parents for foster parents, right? We don't want Muslim parents for foster parents. Does it mean that if Fulton wins, anyone taking foster children can discriminate on any grounds their religion tells them to discriminate on? And so, as I said earlier, my hope is that the court will say, no, we've got to uphold the laws of anti-discrimination, and so that people who want to do business with the city have to respect the rights of gay and lesbian parents, just as they respect other rights. But the issue on the court, and they raise this in the question, is how am I going to write an opinion that, well, do I have to say one thing about racial discrimination, which is really bad, and another about sexual orientation discrimination, which will allow? And that is part of the court's history because there were 4 dissenters in the gay marriage case. And so I think the justices, as the rest of us, are struggling with what we want to say about discrimination. And I think what people need to hear, although I can say people are usually shocked when I say it, is that religious freedom is not always good. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it's not. And so if people think we've got to do what the religions say, then we're going to have a country that allows more and more discrimination instead of more and more equality.
Do we have any sense, Dr. Griffin, from lower court rulings, that have grappled with this issue, where we might be headed with this? I mean, obviously, the Supreme Court is very different today than it was even a few years ago, with more conservative appointments. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. But any hint from lower court rulings, or even things that we've seen kind of bubbling through legislatures around the country, that would give us some sort of hint as to what are the really sticky issues that we're grappling with here?
The current law of the United States Supreme Court says that the free exercise clause means everyone has to follow neutral laws, and that there aren't automatic religious exemptions. And for those of us who promote public health, foster children, good medicine, right, laws against harm, having neutral laws that protect everybody is a great thing. But some religious people argued in this case, because in this case the Third Circuit said the anti-discrimination laws are neutral laws that everybody has to follow. But some people want more free exercise. So there's been a huge debate. Will the court overturn its current rule, which was written by Justice Scalia, and say, oh no, religions get an automatic exemption from the law? Which in my mind would be a terrible theory about free exercise. But that's the huge issue that's at stake here, right? The Third Circuit said everybody has to follow the anti-discrimination laws. And I'm hoping that the Supreme Court of the United States would say everybody has to follow the anti-discrimination laws. You don't get a religious exemption to do what you want to people. But that's what's so intense, and probably why the opinion is taking a time to come down, because they're struggling with just how much religious freedom should we say religions get.
Yes. And the ruling that Dr. Griffin was pointing to in terms of laws of general applicability, that Justice Scalia wrote the opinion in that was the Employment Division versus Smith case. And there is it's a very interesting, I don't know if irony is the right word, but that a very conservative Catholic justice, and the late Justice Scalia did write that ruling that set off this sort of larger conversation about religious liberty and led to the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, a bipartisan piece of legislation back in the 90s. And we've seen in subsequent years how state legislatures have taken a very different understanding of religious liberty, and not at all in line with how I think we thought about this back in the 90s. I do want to move over to Marianne for a few minutes. What are you hoping, Marianne, comes out of this Supreme Court case? And can you sort of reflect on, in terms of some of your concerns, if the justices do rule in favor of Fulton and Catholic Social Services, which I think, given the makeup of this court, is not an unlikely ruling, unfortunately. So what are you thinking about in terms of how this ruling might impact families, and what is your organization potentially going to do in terms of responding to a decision like this?
I have to say, after listening to the oral arguments way back in November, it's hard to be hopeful that a broadly supportive decision is going to come down. So we are definitely preparing for the worst, what we see as the worst case here. Obviously, as I said before, the most immediately impacted negatively by this decision will be children in state care all across the country, who will have their options for stable, loving, permanent homes diminished. Foster care children will have fewer home-based placement, than the likelihood that they will be placed in group homes increases. So the harm to the children is the primary concern, and we will keep working to remove barriers to placement. We're very grateful that most religiously based public service agencies that deal with foster and adoptive youth are moving in the direction of being expansive. So we're really talking about a pretty narrow swath of agencies here. Secondly, of course, the other immediately harmed group will be LGBTQ people who want to parent, and LGBTQ people in general who will be designated to a lower class in our society in some ways, and who will have restrictions on our liberties that do not exist for other people. In the long term, I'm very concerned about what this means for the civil rights and access to publicly funded social services for a broad swath of people. Because if an agency's ability to prioritize their own religious and moral beliefs over the needs of people seeking services is upheld, it could mean anybody who's deemed unacceptable to them, whether they be folks of minority faiths, folks who do not ascribe to a faith, atheists, agnostics, folks who identify as spiritual but not religious, all of those folks whose marital status are in accord, interracial couples, just a whole swath of people in our country may wind up facing additional barriers to accessing services and to other aspects in their life. So I think that this case has incredibly broad potential ramifications that our whole country really needs to be concerned about.
And John, really the same question for you. Just as you look at this case and you kind of reflect on a potential ruling that would go the way of Fulton and Catholic Social Services, we can't be sure of that, but to Marianne's, the same question really I asked to Marianne, just what are you thinking about in terms of the consequences of that kind of decision and how it will impact you and your family and families that you may know who want to have access to these services?
Yeah, obviously, I hope the justices rule on the right side of history here. We'll see. One of the particular arguments in this case that Catholic Social Services made that always seemed a bit disingenuous to me was that if the court ruled in their favor, they could still help prospective LGBTQ foster parents find somewhere else to go. This really has repercussions beyond the city of Philadelphia. There may be plenty of foster care agencies in the city, but what about me, for example? I'm in the rural Midwest, and there are other areas with very few choices when it comes to foster care. And this, of course, applies to other social service agencies as well, and particularly in areas where Catholic charities and other Catholic organizations really have a heavy hand in services that are provided. There are many areas where this could be a real barrier for LGBTQ families, in this case specifically, who want to help children through foster care. I'm not a legal expert, I'm not a lawyer, but it seems to me that a governing body, in this case, the city of Philadelphia, should have the ability to determine with whom it wants to do business. So, for example, I work at a state university, as you mentioned in my introduction, and we have a ton of requirements for every contract we go into. One of those requirements is that external vendors have to meet certain diversity metrics, and if someone doesn't meet those metrics, or even if they do, but they just refuse to tell us that they do, we can't enter a contract with them. So how is this any different? If a private agency wants to provide service to a governmental body, that governmental body should be able to make sure that the private agency is following all of the applicable laws. It's really that simple for me. And also, it seems that if Catholic Social Services wins this case, again, Dr. Griffin, correct me if I'm wrong, but the result would, in essence, be a mandate that would force the city of Philadelphia to enter into contracts with them. And that, I've never heard of that happening before. That seems to me pretty unprecedented, and particularly when the sticky point here is non-discrimination. So that's really where I stand. It seems that the burden here should not be on publicly funded government entities to do business with private agencies that violate the law, but rather the burden is on those private agencies. And by that, I mean, if they want to continue with unfair and unjust policies, if they want to continue discriminating, fine, but they should not be able to do that with public funds. And they should not be able to compel governmental bodies to do business with them.
Yeah, and I should point out, just for context in this conversation, there has been some legislative movement in response to something there's something called the John Lewis Every Child Deserves a Family Act, which has just been reintroduced in Congress by Senator Gillibrand and Representative Danny Davis. And the goal of that legislation is to end LGBTQ discrimination in the child welfare system. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, USCCB, is supporting a different piece of legislation called the Child Welfare Provider Inclusion Act that would approach this in a very different way that we've talked about. Dr. Griffin, I wanted to turn back to you for a second. I mean, as we have discussed, the Supreme Court in recent cases has been very sympathetic to religious liberty claims. Back in 2014, the court ruled in the Hobby Lobby case, which was brought by a Christian evangelical owners of the giant arts and crafts chain, that the corporation had a religious liberty right to deny its employees insurance coverage under insurance coverage of contraception under the Affordable Care Act. And in 2017, the court ruled in favor of a Colorado baker who had refused on religious grounds to create a wedding cake for a same-sex couple. And there's this new study that came out, I think it was in April, published in the Supreme Court Review, which took a very empirical look at these rulings and found that the court has been much more likely to side with religious liberty claims in recent years. And so I'm interested in your sort of take, as we see these tensions over LGBTQ rights and religious liberty escalate, where do you see this going in terms of the court, perhaps legislation and policies that we could see in the next year or moving forward?
Well, for me, it would be a terrible thing if the Supreme Court said there's a free exercise right to disobey the discrimination laws, which is what this court might write. And to me, that sends a terrible signal that I don't think people understand. To me, it is a part. The studies now show that the court is ruling much more for religion than it used to, because in addition, they ruled recently that religious schools have to get funding, right? That you can't keep government funding from religious schools. And they've ruled that religious organizations do not have to obey the employment discrimination laws. If you can call somebody a minister, any employee that a religious organization can call a minister cannot sue for employment misconduct, which is huge, right? There are people in religious schools, universities, hospitals, nursing homes, and once you're a minister, your court case gets dismissed. And so I'd say, I think as many people have written, it's a very pro-religion court. And it is because I think, as I said before, they have the starting idea that religious freedom is always a good that they should protect, because they think it's a good thing. And so I think if this goes forward, as I hope it won't, but if this goes forward for the Fulton side, what the nation will be encouraged to say is, oh, well, religious freedom trumps the law, which is really not what our First Amendment was supposed to do. And, the contraception case that you mentioned, under the Free Exercise Clause, the women won, because the Free Exercise Clause says everybody has to obey neutral laws. But Congress had passed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And so that case was won under a statute which tries to undo the Free Exercise Clause. And that case gives us an idea of what happens if people keep moving to protect religion, as they did in the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and as they might do here with free exercise. And so it's a hard thing to say, as I keep saying, but religions, like other non-religions, do real harm to people when they discriminate. And what we'd have to work together with people in Congress and elsewhere to try to get people to see that discrimination, even if it's religion-based, is not a good thing.
Thank you for that context. That was helpful. Marianne, I wanted to come back to you, because what is sort of elicited by these complicated sort of legal questions, sort of getting back to the internal church conversation about how do we ensure dignity for LGBTQ Catholics, and going back to the Vatican's painful statement on blessing same-sex couples. The thing that I tried to explore in the National Catholic Reporter piece, in part, was looking at sort of could the church possibly, even using its own sort of theological and moral traditions, come to a more expansive understanding of families. And I know there's been theologians who have worked on this and written books about it. I would love to get your perspective on, one, why does the church have a narrow understanding of what a healthy and productive and loving and sacred and holy, to use John's word, family can be? And how do you see any movement or potential opening as you see sort of some of the bishops in Germany speak out, and other bishops around the world speak out against the Vatican statement on the same-sex blessing? Do you see sort of any movement or potential opening here for a better and broader conversation about what a loving and holy family looks like?
Absolutely. And I think that the church is already at that definition. And I understand that's a really provocative statement, but when I talk about the church, I make a very clear distinction between the hierarchy of the Catholic Church and the church as a whole. And and we also have to remember that we're talking about a global institution that expresses itself very differently in different cultures and different countries and different parts of the world. Here in the US and in many other places around the world, as we've cited a number of times in this conversation, Catholics are overwhelmingly supportive of LGBTQI people, of the families that we create, whether that's as a couple or as a couple with children or as an unmarried, unpartnered individual living their life, and also very supportive of civil rights protections in every instance for these folks. Now, the voice of Catholics in the public square is the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, who are pronouncing things and lobbying in ways that actually undermine the beliefs of Catholic voters. And I think until we really deal with that huge gulf that exists between the people of the church, the hierarchy of the church, until politicians at the federal, state, and local level come to realize that these bishops are not really representing the block of voters that they claim to be doing, we're going to continue to have this belief that religion is anti-gay or Catholicism is anti-queer, however you want to put it. We also have to remember that we live in a very pluralistic society, and that most faiths have already institutionally moved much farther along in their journeys towards acceptance of LGBTQI people and other folks who are sort of non-traditional members of their communities than the Catholic institutional structure has. And in our politics and in our civil society, we need to be opening to that diversity of faith. I mean, even this Fulton decision, it's supporting a very narrow group of religious belief. It is not representing the perspective of the majorities of faiths in the city of Philadelphia or across this country. So all of those dynamics are really part of this conversation.
John, I mean, really the same question to you in terms of how do we begin to broaden and expand our appreciation for the dignity and holiness of families in a more expansive way. So I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I think one of the things I'm doing is, even in our conversation today and the way I described my family as holy, that was an intentional choice to use that specific word because of the statement from the Vatican that, you can't bless what isn't holy. And I deny that. I think the majority of Catholics deny that. There is a disconnect between the hierarchy and between the people in the pews, and unfortunately, for me, my struggle is primarily with the hierarchy, but it's also a geographic issue for me, because the way Catholicism is lived out in my local parishes here in Springfield, Illinois, is not something that I can subject myself to or my children to. And I'm not fortunate enough to have a local chapter of Dignity around, or a call to action chapter, or really much of any progressive Catholic presence to support my faith journey. So I'm left now seeking alternatives for me and my family. I found a home in the Unitarian Universalist tradition. For now, at least, I think that's one of the safest places for my children to be exposed to a faith. It's a tradition where I can still hold on to some of the beliefs that I hold dear. I mean, honestly, nobody's going to bat an eye if I walk in there with a rosary, for example. So I can still live out some parts of my Catholicism, but in a safer way. And that's really the best that I've been able to come up with right now.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense.
That does. Thank you. I know we're coming up to time, so I did want to give everyone sort of a chance, if they wanted to kind of offer, a final reflection or a final point, or maybe raise something that you think is important that we didn't have a chance to discuss in the last few minutes that we have. And maybe, Dr. Griffin, if we could start with you, and then we'll go to Mary Ann, and then we'll close out with John.
All right, well, most of you will be too young to remember this, but back in 1960, when the first Catholic president of the United States was elected, the teaching of the Catholic Church was that only Catholics had a right to religious freedom, because only Catholicism was true, and the famous expression was, "Error has no rights." So Catholicism was supposed to be the established religion of every country, and if it wasn't, you had to work until it was. But only Catholics, whether in the majority or the minority, had religious freedom. And so there was a lot of discussion at the time that Catholics would have to get rid of the First Amendment because it did not support Catholic teaching. Now, thanks to the late Jesuit Father John Courtney Murray, Vatican II changed that teaching to say that religious freedom is a right of everyone. He was silenced for many years and originally not invited to the council. And why do I tell you that story? Because it is true that religions change. You saw that with the Bethany group, that they understood, we've got to support gay rights now. And so I think that experience is a lesson that people have to hold on to their belief in their civil rights and hope that over time their churches will move with them, as Mary Ann said, right? That the churches will move with the people instead of with the hierarchy. And so I think long term, that's the hope, that we can keep defending civil rights until everybody catches up.
Yeah, and I appreciate you bringing up John Courtney Murray and that history. If we had more time, we could do a full hour on the nature of religious liberty and how that has changed in terms of how the Catholic Church approaches that. So that's an interesting conversation to have. Mary Ann, how about you?
I think I'm left with two thoughts at the end of this. I would really encourage people of faith to connect their faith to their public policy advocacy, and to speak. I think it's very hard for progressives to often speak as people of faith. Folks who are conservatives are much more comfortable owning that intersection of faith and belief and how it impacts the public square. So we on the progressive side need to get better at that. And I think we have a very important spiritual message that can infuse our politics. And secondly, let's remember that the folks who are getting the most hurt in these situations are children who, as John said, have already experienced tremendous trauma and disruption in their lives if they do not have safe, loving, stable, caring homes. Their possibility for a good outcome in their life is incredibly diminished. So when a child goes into state custody, they belong to all of us. And we as a country need to do a much better job of taking care of those kids.
Well said. John, did you want to offer a few closing thoughts?
Sure. I want to thank you for organizing this, and to the other two panelists here. This has been a stimulating conversation, and an important one too, because so much hangs in the balance here. Those of us who have been involved in foster care for a while know how dire the situation is. We are not at a point where we should be turning anybody away who's qualified and able to provide a loving and stable home to children who need one. And we especially should not be turning people away with public dollars. One closing thought I have as well is that, this isn't really just a Catholic case, and it's not just a case about LGBTQ people. This could impact Muslims, Jews, Mormons, single parents, divorced parents, anybody who doesn't fit someone's particular idea of what a parent should be. And I really think we're just at a point in our human and scientific understanding of sexuality and gender identity that this simply shouldn't be an issue anymore. We should be beyond this. I personally know the pain of someone breaking up my family simply because they didn't like who I am. And I know the pain of losing a child because of bigotry. And let's not forget the harm that's done to that baby who was ripped out of her home after a year with us. So nobody should have to go through what my family did. I hope no one else has to. I hope that in a week we'll be celebrating, but I'm not hopeful. We'll see. But thank you for this conversation.
Well, thank you, John. And that's a very eloquent way to wrap up. And I want to thank all of you. I really am grateful for you sharing your personal stories, which I know are sometimes difficult to share publicly. I want to thank you for your spiritual resilience in the face of all this, and for your legal analysis too, to help us put this in a broader perspective. So deeply grateful and appreciated the conversation. And I want to thank all of you who watched today. We'll continue to track this case, and we'll continue to have these important public conversations at the intersection of religion and politics and public life. So please stay tuned, and thanks again for everyone for watching. Have a great afternoon.